and good day. And as you can see, I'm actually in the grounds of Borley Church at Borley in Essex, which is my proposed start point for a documentary which I wish to share with you on the legend of the long gone Borley Rectory and of course of the church itself. I intend to look more closely at the activities of the infamous ghost hunter Harry Price and of course a number of other characters going back to when the rectory was first built by the Reverend Ball all the way up to its demise, and of course the situation which exists here today and the stories that are attached to the rectory and to the church, which I wish to explain as legend and also fact. Is this area the most haunted area because of what happened at the rectory? Did the ghosts from the rectory transfer themselves into the church? These are largely apocryphal stories that people have conjured up over the years, and I want to look at them in much more detail and share with you my feelings and views of these alleged events. And was Harry Price nothing more than just a fraudster, a charlatan? This I will examine in more detail, and I thank you for joining me on this start point, on this fascinating journey into events which took place here so many years ago.
According to records, the last Borley Rectory was constructed on Hall Road near Borley Church by the Reverend Henry Dawson Ellis Ball in the year 1862, and he moved there a year after being named as rector of the parish. The house replaced an earlier rectory on site that had been destroyed by fire in 1841. It was eventually enlarged by the addition of a wing to house Ball's family of 14 children. It's worth noting that in the 1950s, when they carried out an archaeological excavation of the site, the earliest remains they could find of a rectory dated to around the year 1550 to 1600. Interestingly enough, this finding underscored research by historians in 1939 who claimed there were no records of any religious institution such as a Benedictine priory as ever being built there. A year later, the first paranormal event reportedly occurred, with a few locals having heard unexplained footsteps within the house about that time. Various people claim to have witnessed a variety of puzzling incidents, such as a phantom coach driven by 2 headless horsemen during the next 4 decades. The Reverend Henry Ball, who died in 1892, was also subject to what he reported as paranormal phenomena, but according to his death certificate, he died from locomotor ataxia, which today is known as tabes dorsalis, or in layman's terms, syphilis of the spinal cord and its appendages, and is characterized by shooting pains and other sensory disturbances, and in the later stages by paralysis and death. He also apparently had fathered a number of illegitimate children who also lived at the rectory. After he passed over, his son, the Reverend Henry, or Harry Foyster Ball, took over the living. On the 28th of July 1900, 4 daughters of the rector saw what they thought was the ghost of a nun at twilight and about 40 yards from the house. They tried to talk to it, but it disappeared as soon as they got closer. On one notable occasion, one of the daughters captured a photograph of what they reported to be the ghost nun. Although the clothing worn by the nun appears to be period authentic to their era, and according to more skeptical minds, seems to be one of the daughters, and even more curiously is the fact that the sisters reported seeing a nun dressed in dark clothing, yet this ghost manifestation is wearing light-coloured clothing and nothing at all like a nun's habit. The local organist, Mr. Ernest Ambrose, later said that the family at the rectory were very convinced that they had seen an apparition on several occasions. And sadly, on the 9th of June 1928, the sickly Harry Ball died and the rectory again became vacant. In the following year, on the 2nd of October, the Reverend Guy Eric Smith and his wife moved into the house. Soon after moving in, Smith's wife was shocked while cleaning out a cupboard to come across a brown paper package containing the skull of a young woman. Shortly after, the family reported a variety of incidents, including the sounds of servant bells ringing despite them being disconnected, lights appearing in windows, and unexplained footsteps. In addition, Smith's wife believed she saw a horse-drawn carriage at night. In June 1929, events took a sudden change when the news editor of the Daily Mirror received from one of his staff a letter sent by the rector's wife, Mrs. Smith, asking if his paper knew of the address of the Society of Psychical Research, as they were experiencing unusual happenings in the rectory and wanted them to be investigated. Instead, he dispatched the seasoned reporter, Mr. V.C. Wall, to investigate. Wall, who arrived on the 10th of June, stayed for a week but witnessed nothing unusual. But in true journalistic fashion, he made up stories based on reports involving headless coachmen, nuns, and dragging footsteps. The Smiths were naturally puzzled as to why only a reporter had arrived to start asking awkward questions. Wall reported this difficulty back to his office. The news editor of the Mirror then contacted a committed spiritualist, who was preeminent at the time in the investigation of seances, in the form of Mr. Harry Price. The result was a tsunami of headline stories in the Daily Mirror. Harry Price, who arrived on the 12th of June, immediately reported new phenomena such as the throwing of stones, a vase and other objects. Spirit messages were tapped out also from the frame of a mirror. When they challenged Harry Price as to why he had taken charge of the case when they had requested the Society for Psychical Research, he explained that he attended as a foreign representative of the American Society for Psychical Research. Harry Price stayed only a couple of days in this first week and did not return while the Smiths were in residence, and as soon as he left, these events ceased. Smith's wife later maintained that she already suspected Price, an expert conjurer, of falsifying the phenomena. And they weren't alone in their suspicions, because two staff members, Mary Pearson and Fred Tatum, reported the following as related by Mr. Tatum. There was an incident at his first luncheon when Eva pepper of salt shot across the table, and Price made some reference, no doubt in jocular vein, to ghosts. Later, Mary told Mrs. Smith that she distinctly had seen Price throw one of the other condiments. On another occasion, when they were in the scullery, a storm lantern went out, and Fred was strongly of the opinion that Price had manipulated the wick. Nevertheless, Mr. Wall stayed on and reported back to his daily story. At one time, on the 11th of June, he mistook Mary Pearson, the maid, for the ghost of a nun. She later admitted that she had put the apron over her head as a prank. And on another occasion, the gardener's bonfire seen at twilight was reported back to the Mirror as a spirit. For the night of June the 16th, he had two professional mediums sent down from London. But with Harry Price gone, absolutely nothing had happened. They sat anxiously in darkness at the rectory for many hours to no effect. Mr. Wall seemed unsurprised and phoned through a light-hearted piece, saying that the ghost had flatly declined to exhibit itself. The Smiths had decided that they had had enough and left Borley on the 14th of July 1929, with the parish having some difficulty in finding a replacement. The following year, the Reverend Lionel Algernon Foister, a first cousin of the Bulls, and his wife Marianne moved into the rectory with their adopted daughter Adelaide on the 16th of October 1930. Lionel Foister wrote an account of various strange incidents that occurred between the time the Foisters moved in and October 1935 when they moved out, and this was sent to Harry Price. These included bell ringing, window shattering, throwing of stones, bottles, wall writing, and the locking of their daughter in a room with no key. Marianne Foister reported to her husband a whole range of poltergeist phenomena that included her being thrown from the bed. Before I delve more into the Foisters' tenure at Borley, here is some background on their relationship which may or may not explain some of the alleged paranormal events purportedly witnessed by Marianne. She was 22 years younger than her husband Lionel, and he was in very poor health, suffering from rheumatoid arthritis. Lionel and Marianne had been married in Brunswick, Nova Scotia, in August 1922, when she was 23 and he 45. What was not revealed is the fact that Marianne was still married to an Irishman, a Mr. Greenwood, who she married in 1914 when she was just 15. She had lied about her age, claiming in fact that she was 17, and despite her marriage to Lionel, there was absolutely no proof of a divorce. The relationship between Lionel and Marianne seems to have been more than a little strange. Lionel clearly worshipped his young wife. What Lionel didn't know was that she was having a torrid affair with a lodger, a man by the name of Frank Peerless from Bermondsey in London. Lionel later supported both Marianne and Peerless by investing into a flower shop business in Wimbledon. While this business was in operation, Marianne and Peerless lived in London during the week and only returned to Borley at weekends. Suffice to say, people in London were under the impression that both Marianne and Peerless were married. Both she and Peerless had a sometimes violent relationship. On at least one occasion, Marianne explained to Harry Price that the black eye that she was sporting was caused by the Borley ghost, but it seems much more likely that this was a result of her constantly feuding with Peerless. In 1934, the flower shop went out of business and things briefly became very complicated when Peerless attempted to blackmail Lionel by threatening to reveal details of his affair with Marianne to the church authorities. This was resolved when Peerless ran off and later married a 16-year-old girl who had worked in the shop. By now, this situation had placed the Foysters in some financial difficulty. It was clear that Lionel's ill health meant that he would not be able to work for much longer. What little money the couple had left went when the flower shop business failed. In late 1934, Marianne moved into a flat in Ipswich, where she lived as Miss Foyster while Lionel stayed in Borley. In February 1935, Marianne married Henry Fisher, despite the fact that on paper she was still married to Lionel. Fisher was a man troubled by mental health problems, though he was a person of independent means thanks to his wealthy family. Incredibly, Mr. and Mrs. Fisher then returned to live briefly at Borley Rectory with Marianne's father, Lionel. One can only imagine how painful this must have been for him. In October 1935, Marianne, Lionel and Fisher left Borley Rectory and moved into a cottage near Ipswich. Lionel was by now so ill he was unable to work, and he lived in a converted loft space above the cottage, posing as Marianne's devoted but bedridden father. This marks the end of the Foysters' association with Borley. Because of the publicity in the Daily Mirror, these incidents attracted the attention of several psychic researchers, who, after investigation, were unanimous in suspecting that they were caused by Marianne Foyster. Harry Price was born in Streatham in South London in the year 1881. As a child, Price had a very inquiring mind and developed many interests, particularly so in astronomy, performance art, conjuring and archaeology. Around 1898, Price began attending evening spiritualist meetings and also took part in some private seances, which initiated his interest into the paranormal. He also developed an interest in coin collecting. In 1908, he moved to Pulborough, West Sussex and worked as a salesman for paper merchants, and as a side interest wrote articles for 2 local newspapers. He later married an heiress, Constance Mary Knight, and they settled for the next 40 years in that town. This freedom from the necessities of having to work for a living gave Harry Price the ability to delve into his many interests, with spiritualism being the top of his priorities. Her family, however, the Knights, have strongly disagreed with the contention that Price lived from her private income, but here I digress. In 1920, Price joined the Society for Psychical Research, the SPR, and during the 1920s, Price exposed a number of fake but famous mediums and gained a reputation for this field of paranormal research. Price formed an organisation in 1926 called the National Laboratory for Psychical Research as a rival to the Society for Psychical Research because of a number of disputes he had with them. In 1924, the National Laboratory of Psychical Research, which held Price's collection, was reconstituted as the University of London Council for Psychical Investigation. He had earlier made a formal offer to the University of London to equip and endow a department of psychical research and loan the equipment of the National Laboratory and its library. Here is a segment from a film Harry shot in 1936 at his laboratory based in the University of London. At this point, Harry was quite famous in the media through his work, and of course his involvement with the now notorious Borley Rectory saga, but his scientific mythology was later exposed as a flim-flam investigation of Borley.
What is psychical research? A popular opinion says that it means going to seances, holding hands in the dark, singing hymns, and perhaps getting in touch with your dead relatives. But in this, popular opinion is only partly correct, because it is confusing a psychical research with a spiritualism. A psychical research is a science and is rapidly becoming an exact science. Its object is to ascertain by exact experimental methods how far the alleged phenomena of the seance room can be brought into line with normality. These phenomena, which are produced by people who claim abnormal powers and who call themselves mediums, can be divided into physical and mental. The mental includes clairvoyance, psychometry, the direct voice which spirits are supposed to produce at seances, and similar manifestations. The physical phenomena includes telekinesis, or the abnormal movement of objects without physical contact, the poltergeist phenomena you read about in connection with haunted houses, and similar manifestations. There is an idea that the study of alleged abnormal phenomena is quite modern, but that is not the case. People have been interested in psychic phenomena from the very earliest time.
Price was also friends with other debunkers of fraudulent mediums, including Harry Houdini and the journalist Ernest Palmer. But the career high point in Harry's life came at the end of the 1920s when, following a call from the Daily Mirror, he visited to investigate Borley Rectory. Borley remained vacant for some time after the Foysters' departure, and in May 1937 Price took out a 1-year-long rental agreement with the Queen Anne's Bounty, which is basically the church commissioners, the owners of the property. Through an advertisement in the Times on the 25th of May 1937 and subsequent personal interviews, Price recruited a corps of 48 official observers, mostly students who spent periods mainly during weekends at the rectory with the instructions to report any phenomena that occurred. Here is an interesting account given by Charles Winter, a former Times newspaper editor who ran into Price's corps as an official observer. While at Borley, Winter came to two conclusions. One is that the rectory was indeed haunted, but on the dark side, in his opinion, Price was egging up some of the events which were alleged to have taken place, which of course cast a serious doubt on the credibility of the entire investigation. The experiences alleged by Marianne Forster seemed to gain some traction when in March 1938 Helen Glanville, the daughter of S.J. Glanville, one of Price's helpers, conducted a planchette séance in Streatham in South London. Price reported that she made contact with two spirits, the first of which was that of a young nun who identified herself as Marie Lair. According to the planchette story, Marie was a French nun who left her religious order and travelled to England to marry a member of the Waldegrave family, the owners of Borley's 17th century manor house, Borley Hall. She was said to have been murdered in an older building on the site of the rectory, and her body either burned in the cellar or thrown into a disused well. The wall writings were alleged to be her pleas for help. One read, "Marianne, please help me get out." The second spirit to be contacted identified himself as Sunek Samares and claimed that he would set fire to the rectory at 9 o'clock that night on the 27th of March 1938. He also said at that time that the bones of a murdered person would be revealed. Onto the scene in 1937 came a new player into this saga, a Captain Gregson, who was interested in buying Borley Rectory to open it as some form of commercial enterprise. William Hart Gregson was born in 1879 in Halton, Lancashire, the son of Reverend Jesse Gregson and his wife Sarah. By the 1901 census, William had moved to Essex and was living in a boarding house in Colchester, with his occupation stated as that as an architect. He was in the military during World War I and served in the Royal Engineers, where he was made a temporary lieutenant in 1915. He was known as captain after the war, and this appears in records from about 1923, because in that year Gregson found himself in the dock where he was charged with attempting to fraudulently procure an entry into the land registry. The case was sent to the jury and Gregson was let out on bail. When the case was heard in November that year, the jury found the defendant guilty of uttering but without intent to defraud. The judge remarked that he was pretty lucky. And so now he had bought the redundant rectory with £500 which he had borrowed and was planning to make it into a tourist attraction. However, Gregson's plans did not turn out as he expected, and on the night of 27 February 1939, a fire broke out and the building was completely destroyed. His attempts at a tenfold profit by over-insuring did not succeed, as the insurers would have been only too well of Gregson's colourful past, but regardless he was determined on a return for his efforts. From nowhere he created several myths, including one of missing church plate, and ignoring the difficult fact that such things were always well documented, he urged all and sundry to start digging in the ruins. With increasing pressure on Price to organise a dig at Borley, it became more and more difficult to rely on his innate wisdom that told him it was nonsense. The dig took place in difficult wartime conditions on the 17th of August 1943 and included, according to Price, the Reverend and Mrs. Henning, Captain Gregson, Dr. Eric Bailey, a pathologist, his brother and Flying Officer Creamer. Reverend Henning's gardener Jackson did all the heavy digging. It was indeed fortuitous that Price had thought of inviting a pathologist along for this exploratory dig. 3 feet down they came upon a bone that the Reverend Henning's gardener Jackson, a former farm labourer, immediately identified as the jawbone of a pig, and passed it on to Henning, who took it on to Price. However, when it was handed to Mr. Bailey, the pathologist, he pronounced it to be human, and more digging produced part of a cranium. Here, at least in Price's mind, was the confirmation that this was the remains of the young nun, Marie-Laire. Johnny Palmer, who worked at Borley Place for the Pains, observed the dig. He saw the bones and maintained the unshakable view that what he saw was old Sal's bones. Subsequently, the bones were given a Christian burial in Liston churchyard after the parish of Borley refused to allow the ceremony to take place on account of the local opinion that the bones were those of a pig. In fact, as you can see here on this side-by-side comparison image, it would appear definitely to be that of a pig and not a human jawbone, and the differences are quite noticeable. Price's discovery of the bones had also been the subject of debate. Critics have questioned the likelihood of Price turning up bones in a single search in only a few hours, when other searches, both before and after Price's excavation, came up empty-handed despite far more extensive digging. They also questioned the fortuitous presence of a pathologist and a barrister to certify the remains, and to make it even more confusing, the 2 gardeners who did the actual digging, Johnny Palmer and Mr. Jackson, identified the only bone recovered as a pig's jawbone. To understand Harry Price in greater detail, we must look firstly at a number of inconsistencies in the past where clearly he was not telling the truth. Firstly, he claimed he was born into an affluent Shropshire family, but in fact he was born in London. In his autobiography, Search for Truth, written between 1941 and 1942, Price claimed he was born as a Shropshire lad, and also claimed that he was involved with archaeological excavations in Greenwich Park, London. But in earlier writings on Greenwich, he denied any such involvement. In 1908, Price wrote for two local Sussex newspapers, the West Sussex Gazette and the Southern Weekly News, in which he related his remarkable propensity for discovering clean antiquities. One of these, a silver ingot discovered by Richard Morris to be housed in Price's own collection of artefacts at Senate House, University of London, found it to be made of base metals and was stamped around the time of the last Roman Emperor Honorius. In 1910, Professor E.J. Haverfield of Oxford University, the country's foremost expert on Roman history and a Fellow of the Royal Academy, declared the ingot to be fake. He reported that the double-axe type of silver ingot was well known and dated from the late imperial times, but the one recovered from Sussex was an inferior copy of one found at the Tower of London, and with alterations to give it an air of authenticity. Both the shape and lettering betrayed its origin. In 1927, Price claimed that he had come into the possession of Joanna Southcott's box and arranged to have it opened in the presence of one reluctant prelate, the Bishop of Grantham. It was found to contain only a few oddments and unimportant papers, among them a lottery ticket and a horse pistol. His claims to have had the true box have been disputed by historians and of course by followers of Southcott.
But I think the most extraordinary was the opening of Joanna Southcott's famous box. This box was opened at the Church House, Westminster, in 1927, and a wave of excitement passed through the audience as I cut the steel bag. The box contained the most extraordinary collection of objects. Here is a wire puzzle, a very ancient puzzle. Joanna Southcott's nightcap, very curious. A dice box, but what Joanna wanted with a dice box I can't say. A lottery ticket, number 382 for 1814. I'm afraid it didn't win anything. A horse pistol. An ancient purse full of really very valuable coins. This is the most interesting exhibit. Books, several books as a matter of fact, and a piece of paper printed on the Thames, February the 3rd, 1814. Well, I have shown you the very curious contents of that box, but I'm afraid that there was nothing in it which Joanna Southcott said would save the nation in a time of emergency.
One wonders why the great and intrepid ghost hunter Harry Price never actually investigated Borley Church. For sure, thorough investigations were carried out within the rectory, and also some, shall we say, questionable activities were reported, but no thorough investigation by him or any of his staff were carried out inside the church. And yet in 1942, the Reverend A.C. Henning reported that objects inside the church were being displaced and moved around. But for some reason, Harry Price decided not to go into the church to carry out a further investigation. In 1892, the Reverend Henry Ball also complained of tapping noises and objects being moved around inside the church. And of course, once the rectory was finally destroyed and buried, many presumed that the spiritual presences which inhabited the rectory had actually moved across the road and had, shall we say, taken up residence inside the church. Here I'm walking along the actual church path where so many people have heard so many footsteps of unseen bodies. And certainly it continued further in the year of 1947. A gentleman who bought a cottage attached to the churchyard reported that he could hear people indeed walking along the church path at different times of the day and night, and of course there was nobody there. And in 1949, a lady by the name of Suzanne Woodruff was actually visiting the church on a cold February afternoon, when she too, walking along this very same footpath, could hear footsteps behind her. But then she was overcome by the most amazing and most nauseating smell. Could it have been vomit, or could, as she described it, have been embalming fluid? But she said the smell rank so foully, it could have been, in fact, a rotten human corpse. And yet, on the subject of strange aromas, there is another tale to tell of a Mr. Clinton Tweed of Cambridge who visited the church, but his experience of the smell wasn't as though it smelt like embalming fluid. In fact, he felt it smelt like incense being burnt. Now, of course, a lot of people would argue that perhaps it was a windy day and perhaps someone was burning a bonfire, because he did describe the smell as being something like a bonfire of incense, and perhaps it was a smell from a fire that had wafted in across the fields. But how does that experience relate to the other reports of strange smells within the churchyard? So I don't think necessarily that story could be discounted, but it's something which can be added to the rich history of this very ancient site. Strangely, in June 1947, Harry Price was invited by the Reverend Henning and his wife to attend the church. It was a rededication service to the Waldegrave tomb, which had been recently restored. Whilst they were inside the church, all of a sudden and from nowhere, the sound of birds screeching, and that was accompanied by the sound of footsteps on the path leading to the church. Again they investigated, and there was no trace and no cause for the birds to be screeching. Apparently, one of the most chilling tales occurred on the 15th of September of 1947, when a Mr. John May cycled down one evening from Bury St Edmunds to Borley Church, arriving around 10:30. He went into the church and sat in the porch when he was startled to hear the sound of the actual church gate being clicked open, and that was followed again by footsteps which came closer and closer and closer until they eventually arrived at the church, and then there was nothing. Absolutely nothing at all. And the history of this building seems to relate very self-determinedly to two main focused areas of activity, which is the clicking or the tapping of the tomb and the gate, and also the footsteps on the path leading to the church. I can attest to part of this. I came here a few years ago in the depths of winter, I think it was New Year's Day, where I carried out an impromptu investigation of wandering around the churchyard, and I was more than confident that I was being followed around. I could definitely hear footsteps behind me, and that seems to be one of the phenomena of this particular site. So there is an interesting history attached to a wonderful building, but unfortunately the likelihood, certainly in recent times, of it being investigated is fairly remote. And so we have to rely back to a film made in the 1970s by the BBC, who carried out their own investigation, and here is the actual clip of that investigation.
So we're in and listen to those recordings, and a warning: do not adjust your television picture. Now, my tape recorder is down by the tomb. What family is this?
This is the tomb of the Waldegrave family, who were associated with the area for many years, and there's a possibility that one of this family is the origin of the figure who's been described as a ghost nun.
How can a Waldegrave be a nun?
Well, the figure has been described as having a veiled headdress, and it's not certain that she's a nun. Also, this tomb has been the scene of a number of inexplicable incidents. People have heard the sound of earth falling, of raps and taps, and even are some reports of some of the pillars moving. I'm not too happy about that.
Well, maybe this is what we have on this tape. I'll play it to you now, and we'll see if Stephen Hollingworth got anything like you were talking about.
Our investigation was to be carried out in the church, and we came armed with tape recorders. We left the two recorders running on their own inside the building. Before locking the machines in, we searched the building. This session proved to be the most exciting one, for we firmly believe we recorded the sound of a ghost stepping forward and opening something which sounds like a door. At first, we thought we'd recorded the sound of the chancel door being opened, so we investigated this possibility. But neither of these sounds in any way seems to match the ghostly one. Nothing in the vicinity of the altar that we could find could account for the strange recording. We were so intrigued by these events that we returned to the church the following Saturday and spent the entire night there. Having searched the building once more, we locked the machines in, and already the atmosphere seemed to be changing. Two of the team said they felt they were being watched by somebody. Now follows the most remarkable sound of all, for quite clearly the centre microphone picked up what obviously is a human sigh. After this, we decided to break the sequence of visits and to try again during summer conditions. We started recording about 1 a.m, and the first tapes revealed the natural ambience of the building and nothing else. But as we entered the church at about 1:45, we all felt a change in atmosphere. I had a definite tingle pulsing through my body, and a feeling as though a presence were pressing against my back. And yet there was nothing horrific about it. We felt certain, however, that this run would produce results, and we were right. It's the most surprising sound we've heard to date, and we were able to locate it as originating just in front of the altar rail.
If there is anybody in this church who is trying to communicate with us, we'd be grateful if you would try and do something tonight. Perhaps you could give us some indication of how we can help you.
At about 3:20 in the morning, we picked up the sound of faint rapping. The team made another random visit at the end of August. A watch was kept throughout the night on the chancel door, and this proved worthwhile, for in the small hours a glow was observed around the door, as though a phosphorescent aura were emanating. On this occasion, the church produced yet another sound. This ended with a rather more frightening sigh. For the fifth visit, it was decided to keep the church manned with observers throughout the entire night. On previous occasions, we'd obtained the best results by leaving the equipment locked inside on its own, and we wondered whether the human presence might have some adverse effect on conditions. At about 4:10 in the morning, 3 of us kept watch on the choir stall adjacent to the altar. This was to be a memorable and frightening occasion. For most of the period, there were odd clicks and taps generated in the area of the font. But as it was extremely dark, we could see nothing. Then we began to see tiny points of light hovering on the curtain behind the font and on one of the pews about 1/4 of the way down the church. At first, we thought we couldn't believe our own eyes, and each one of us thought we were suffering from fatigue, until we broke the silence to speak about it.
I think I must be getting tired and I keep seeing things. And Jerry, are you watching Peter with the curtain?
In the pews, the first few pews.
Yes, that's where I'm seeing them. I do my...
It lights up the floor as well. Oh, it flashes on and off, a good story, really.
Yes, I saw one just then too.
The main one is up in the curtain, eh? On the right-hand side, right in the curtain.
Very curious, isn't it? Yes, there's one pew again then.
Yeah.
No, we're not seeing things, Peter. The 3 of us can see them, so it obviously exists, whatever it is. It's a strange phenomena.
Long strip.
It's stripped this time, wasn't it? Let's see that. Now, that was fantastic. We've no idea what that was. It certainly made all of us jump, as though some object had been thrown down. It's curious that that seemed to have been tied up, but you're getting colder and colder. It's like a build-up of power.
After a while, we realized the lights were coming closer to us. But although we stuck our ground, there were no further audible disturbances in the church, and the lights eventually vanished. As to what they mean, it's anybody's guess. But whatever they are physical. The microphones prove that.
Would you say that, well, as an expert, that these are things that are happening outside that people are observing, or that they're things that they are projecting from their own minds and think they're seeing?
Well, there I really go back to this atmospheric photograph theory. See, if we don't know really, but it may be that all our thoughts, all our actions may be recorded on some sort of eternal tape, and under certain conditions, maybe climatic conditions, maybe in the presence of certain people, occasionally they reappear. We just don't know. I don't honestly think that the figures that are seen represent an afterlife. I think it's much more likely that it's some kind of echo of the previous life.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, the story of Borley Rectory, as events really played out by focusing more on the characters and less on what they had to say. And I think that's crucial here. If we follow all the many different lines of alleged paranormal activities that were taking place at the rectory, they're invariably contradicted at a later date by other alleged activity. And if we go back to the beginning, shall we say, of the nun who was a ghost, that would appear to have tied into a number of stories in circulation during the late Victorian period, which it is believed that the Ball sisters actually conjured up from one of those stories to perhaps alleviate the boredom of living in a fairly isolated rectory some miles from a nearest town, in which case would be Sudbury in Suffolk. But unfortunately, with all of the stories that we're looking at here today, you have to go by what is being offered and how you can follow it through. And as a former police detective, the first thing that I would look at in more detail are the characters of those who are involved. And certainly Marianne Foister comes out in a very, very poor light. And of course, you'll note that she was central to much of the activity that was reported during the 1930s. It all seemingly happened around her. If we go back to Price's initial visit with Mr. V.C. Wall from the Daily Mirror, you'll note that Mr. Wall was less than honest in the way that he described events which did or did not take place at the rectory. And this was compounded because during the period that Price was there, which I believe initially was 2 days, a reporter from the Daily Mail arrived and obviously wanted to get one over on the opposition, in this case the Daily Mirror. He noted that Price was carrying a pocket full of pebbles, which appeared to be being thrown at crucial moments when alleged paranormal activity was taking place. And this reporter actually challenged Price on what he had in the contents of his pocket. How would I describe Harry Price as a human being? I think that in the 1920s, when he started on the rocky road, he was honest in what he was doing, in exposing fraudulent mediums, and made a number of significant finds where people that were long regarded as being the absolute truth of paranormality and spiritualism were discovered to be nothing more than charlatans. And in a way, that perhaps is what happened to Harry. You'll notice that during his life, he certainly had a hang-up about where he was born by telling people he was born in Shropshire to an affluent family, which he was not. And you'll notice in the manner that he talks on his video, he tries to come across as almost a scientific authoritative figure, but doesn't quite make the mark, in my opinion. And of course, bolstered by the generous bequest that he made to the London University to house his collection, it added a stamp of approval and authority. And that is something that he was seeking his entire life. And so one can imagine when the Daily Mirror invited him to go to Borley Rectory, It must have been like 1,000 Christmases coming true, all at the same time. With Price, it wasn't a question of money, it was a question of fame. He wanted acknowledgement for the person that he was in life, and he felt that the rectory was going to be the deserving cause that would provide that credibility that he's so longly sought for. I mean, the most ridiculous aspect of the Borley investigation, and one must agree to this, is the alleged discovery of the bones in the cellar. That cellar had been well dug previously by other people. It wasn't just a question of Price being the first man there to start digging. And the fact that he brought with him a pathologist and a lawyer, obviously to authenticate and rubber stamp that any discoveries were genuine, seemed to add some weight to a suggestion made that perhaps this pig bone was actually planted there. And I come back to the reference to pig bone. I think that's important because when you listen to many accounts today that people speak about Borley Rectory, they stick longingly to the fact that that bone which was discovered was that of that dead nun, which confirms the entire story was genuine. I mean, how can it not be genuine? A medium in Streatham in London says that they would discover the remains of a woman, and sure enough they did. And the credibility that would have added to his prestige for Harry Price was certainly worth setting up this particular event. I have absolutely no qualms in denouncing him for that. I think that the entire act was set up by him, and that the willing players, like for example the RAF pilot officer, why on earth would he have been there? He probably was staying as a guest of one of the local notables in the area and heard about this and decided to come along. And of course the local priest was there as well, which is understandable in the circumstances when it's alleged that the person who was buried there was a nun. But it again has a ring of farcicality about it, as with all of the events which had taken place at the rectory. And certainly when you look back at the history of the site, there is absolutely no reference in any books anywhere on this planet to attest to the fact that there was any type of religious institution built at Borley other than the vicarages which followed. And I think that it was essential for them to try and cement that last brick into place to confirm that this story was true. But unfortunately, the beauty about history is that history is unalterable. It is what it is. It is events which have taken place and passed. Sure, people can rewrite them and alter them in some way, but the history is always there. And it certainly doesn't take anyone too long to start delving more deeply to actually discover what the truth was. Coming back to the headless coachman ghosts that have been seen at Borley Rectory, which allegedly was connected to the ghost of the dead nun. Another complete nonsense, because during the medieval period, they didn't actually have coaches, more like wagons which were partially covered. And it wasn't until, I believe, the 16th century that the coaches that we understand to be to this day actually arrived on scene. Prior to that, they were very, very basic. So that story in itself doesn't hold much water. Okay, let's come back to what is really going on at Borley Rectory, what really took place there. I have no doubts whatsoever in my mind that Borley Rectory was haunted, absolutely no doubts at all. And especially when you consider that it was built over part of the original rectory, which dated back to 1550 to 1600, whatever occurred there was likely to have continued onwards into the rectory. I certainly dispute heavily any notion of a ghostly nun. I honestly believe that there is a ghost that exists there, perhaps, who looks like a nun but isn't a nun, because if you look back towards the medieval period, again, women tended to dress a little bit like nuns. They had their heads covered. They wore very similar clothing, and of course it was differently coloured to how a nun would dress, but even so, just by point of reference, they looked very similar. So it could have easily have been somebody all the way back from the 14th or indeed the 15th century that was haunting the site from the time of the earliest rectory. But there's certainly no evidence whatsoever to suggest that the site is haunted by the ghost of a nun, and the headless horseman could be a genuine manifestation which came in as a result of the first rectory being haunted. But again, there are no documents to attest to that. It's just my own personal opinion. I think that it's a tragedy that was waiting to happen. From the moment the Daily Mirror got involved, the media were involved, it was like a runaway roller coaster. It just continued to run and run and run. And eventually the roller coaster lost its tracks and came off. And in this case, it meant the demise of the rectory because it was sold to a rather shady character, Captain Gregson, who in fact was never attained the rank of captain, only acting lieutenant. So his rank was probably that as a sergeant. And of course he preferred to be addressed as the captain when he came out of the military, and that was quite a common feature during World War I and World War II. People that came out of the military tried to assume themselves to be somebody they weren't, and that was the way the world that was at that time. But certainly by placing Harry Price on board with the Daily Mirror certainly cemented the fate of the rectory, in my opinion. And it is such a shame that it's gone, because it's another historic building that is no longer. And I suppose today the people that live in Borley certainly want closure on Borley Rectory. So the tragedy is today that the rectory is gone. There's no way that anybody can go back there and actually find out what the level of activity is or was inside the rectory. And so it's long gone to history, but at least we still have the church and the wonderful stories which are attached to it. So sadly, Borley Rectory is a great story for a movie, but as a real event is really a bit of a washout. What the appeal of Borley Rectory is not on the hauntings, but on the characters involved, and I think I've done justice there. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed my para-documentary on Borley Rectory, and I can't wait to get back and do some proper investigation. Until the next time.